All right. Welcome into another edition of the HoosierIllustrated.com football postgame wrap-up show. In touch with Indiana Sports podcast host John Alden with you, as well as Hoosier Illustrated staff writer Dylan Traeger. And my goodness, I mean, we're talking about a 9-0 Indiana team for the first time in school history. They're one win away from their first ever 10-win season because, as you may have seen, the 1945 team went 9-0-1. They had a tie in their second game of the season. But, man, I don't even know where to start, Dylan, because there's so many things that we can talk about with this Indiana team in general. They were down 10-0 to start the game. People were talking about how good was Curtis Rourke going to look in his first game back from the thumb surgery and sitting out last week against Washington. And we saw yet another dominant performance basically from being down 10-0 onward. Indiana took complete control of the game, and they end up winning 47-10 in, again, I said this a second ago, what was yet another dominant overall performance from this Curt Cignetti coach team. So I'll go ahead and throw it over to you. Just go ahead and give me your initial thoughts on really where we are in general, and maybe this game in general as well, whatever you decide.
John, I'm going to be honest. It's really hard to not stop and just smile and be happy right now. A great game from Indiana that didn't start off so well. And you got to really look at Coach Cignetti's coaching there to start from that 10-0 deficit to start the game. Indiana hasn't trailed once this season. So to start a game like that and really recover is incredible. But looking back at the first quarter of the run game, really didn't look too good, which is surprising because last week that's what Taven Jackson relied on. So I was kind of surprised by that, to see the run game struggle, and it continued to sort of struggle the rest of the game. But when your receivers are hot like they were today, you don't really need a run game.
Yeah, and even it felt like, I remember talking with my wife, we were sitting down watching the game, when Michigan State had control in the early few possessions and Indiana couldn't really get much going on offense. I said to my wife, I feel like once this team is able to find a rhythm offensively, they're going to be able to get down. They can get on the board, get a touchdown. I think that's going to really get something going. I didn't know to the extent of what that would look like, because before they found a rhythm, I mean, there was a wide open pass thrown to Miles Cross, who has been one of Indiana's most reliable receivers, and he just dropped it. And it was one of the easiest passes I feel like he could have caught. But once Curtis Rourke and the offense was able to find a rhythm, they got that first score, then the second score, and then the floodgates were opened. It felt like there was no looking back. They got a couple of interceptions, both by Amari Farrell. And that's another part of this team that really has been consistent of the last few games, with getting interceptions and turnovers at some of the most opportune times, beginning back with the Nebraska game. I feel like you had the big interception from Sean Asbury that was nearly a pick six at the beginning of the second half. Then you had back-to-back interceptions from D'Angelo Pons last week against Washington. Now you have back-to-back interceptions from Amari Farrell. So the love's been spreading around on offense when it comes to the interceptions. And overall, just really a great performance in general by the defense today.
And you see the way this defense sort of plays every game, and you sort of think you're going to have to rely on the defense with the way the offense opens up every game. But to be able to capitalize on those interception plays and be able to jump player to player on interceptions, as you said, Sean Asbury doing it one game, D'Angelo Pons the next game, and then all of a sudden today, Amari Farrell goes off for 2 interceptions. Just being able to rely on every player to have a good game each week is really everything you can hope for on the defense. And then how about the defensive line today?
Yes,
7
the
sacks?
pass rush, insane.
Are you kidding? Crazy stuff today. Crazy stuff. I can't believe it.
And Mikael Kamara is probably, I don't know if at this point he'll be the most underrated defensive player in the nation, because definitely when you look at the Big Ten, I think the Big Ten is very aware of how good Mikael Kamara is for this Indiana defense. If he's not getting the national recognition this week, I'd be very surprised, because he is one of the many rocks on this Indiana defense, along with guys like Aiden Fisher and the guys who've also been getting crucial interceptions, as we mentioned earlier. There's just so much. And I've been afraid to say this word all season long, just because a lot of people tend to think that this isn't really the case with Indiana. But I do think there's a lot of talent on this Indiana team as a whole. People just like to say that, it's just all these guys who have played together for years at JMU and they just really connect and it's a well-oiled machine. There is truth to that. But at some point, I think we have to start talking about the fact that not only is the team well connected, but there is a lot of talent all around, whether it be offense or defense, that needs to start getting the respect that it deserves. I mean, you've won 9 games. You've won all of them in dominant fashion. You have 3 games remaining before you get to the postseason, and there's been no reason other than maybe the first half of the first quarter of this game to potentially doubt Indiana.
And I've been saying to myself this whole season that I don't think there's a hole anywhere on this Indiana team. And every time I say that, people say the rebuttal to me, well, Indiana hasn't played a real team. These games upcoming are trap games against bad teams. But Indiana continues to come out, and to be honest, they curb stomp every one of these teams each week, which is just what really makes not only me, but this entire country excited to see what Indiana can keep doing going forward. I mean, beating a Big Ten rival team like the way they did today is really exciting to see.
And one thing that I think is very interesting, kind of poetic, when you think about the way that this regular season is going to wind down, Indiana's schedule very fittingly ends with all 3 of the teams that Kurt Signetti called out during his opening speech at Assembly Hall to the students back in, what was it, December or January. Of course, Purdue, Michigan, and Ohio State, not necessarily in that order, but you finish the year off with Michigan next week at home. You have your second bye week right after that. Then you travel back on the road to Columbus to face Ohio State. And then, of course, you end the year with the Old Oak and Bucket game. And, I mean, what are we looking at here? I mean, I said this on Twitter or X, whatever you refer to it as, before the game ended. I think next week for Indiana is, and some people may disagree with this, maybe not in circles of Indiana, but those on the outside. I think next week is a college football playoff play-in game for Indiana, because at that point, you get to 10 wins. Your only potentially expected loss would be to Ohio State, and I think most people are on the side of, if Indiana finishes the season 11-1, that there's no reason they shouldn't be in the college football playoff.
I mean, for me, I've seen what the spreads are, and I've seen what people are favoring for the next few games. I don't care what anyone's saying. I don't want to hear people saying some games are trap games or Indiana should be scared going into them. I think Indiana has proven the credibility going into this to go onto the road with a quarterback that's not fully healthy and blow out Michigan State says all that's needed to be said. And there hasn't really been a spot in the season where I don't think Indiana as a team has been nervous at any point of a game. I think the team has just put the games away so early. And I think that says enough going forward for what's going to happen. I think Michigan's going to be definitely a real test. It's going to be a tough game. Same with Ohio State. But having Michigan back at home and then having the bye week after the game is definitely going to help.
Yeah, it's again, I mentioned this at the very beginning of the year, with the bye weeks separated the way that they were. Your first one being at the halfway point in the season, and then the second one being sandwiched right in the middle of Michigan and Ohio State. I don't think that really plays out too much better for your favor if you're Indiana. Real quick, I want to get to a couple of comments here on YouTube. First, Derby says, I was wrong. I thought Michigan State would give Indiana problems with that crowd, but they didn't even have a crowd. They had a crowd for a little bit, but there was definitely a lot of red in there. But once things were, shifting towards Indiana's favor, especially once the game really got out of hand, you did see those stands empty out. And I don't know if you saw this, Dylan, but right when Michigan State was up 10-0, I saw Zach Osterman put out that there was an overrated chant going on with the Michigan State students, which I've never really understood the point of doing an overrated chant in general, because not only is the game, especially when they did it, the game was early, it doesn't really make you look too good for your team, because wouldn't it rather be seen from your side of things that you beat a good team, not an overrated team? I've never really seen the benefit of the overrated chant.
I definitely agree with you. And I think for Indiana to go out and put 47 straight points on Michigan State after those chants started really silenced them. I saw one tweet of the whole student section empty by the third quarter.
Well, that's what Indiana used to be like.
That's what it used to be like. I'm used to it. You're used to it. And the funny thing was, as soon as that sort of started emptying out, watching the game on Peacock, they weren't showing the stands. anymore. And I think that really shows a lot to, not only what the team is like there, but the culture too. They've got that similar culture to what Indiana had the last few years for sure.
Yeah. Tanis writes and says, I called 49-10. I was so close. Yeah, obviously 47-10 being the final score. First of all, props to you, Tanis, on from the get-go, just predicting that Indiana was going to once again take care of business. You had a lot more confidence than I did. I had been circling this game on the calendar for a few weeks now as something that I was potentially worried about. And simply for the reasons that this, in my opinion, would have been Indiana's first real road environment, because the Northwestern game was kind of funky where you're playing in that temporary stadium. You have a lot of Indiana alum in Chicago, making it easy for fans to travel. And then the game before that was on the road, the Rose Bowl with UCLA, also a very unique scenario where the home crowd isn't your typical Big Ten style of stadium environment that maybe you're used to in this conference. So it's very impressive to see Indiana really, other than the beginning of the first quarter, do what they've been doing all season long and not really being affected at all from that moment forward in this game by the crowd.
I totally agree with you. And when I walked into the stadium last week for the Washington game, I was pretty nervous for that game for Indiana, having Taven Jackson start. It was his first start since Michigan of last year, which was early October. So it's been over a year since he started a game for Indiana. And he definitely got bailed out, I think is the right word, by the run game. He only had 11 completions the entire game, and the run game and the defense really helped him out. So yeah, you get some of those jitters out of you early on. They won the game, which is great, but I was going to be very nervous if he had the nod to start against Michigan State on the road.
Yeah, it would have been something that would have made fans more cautious, and people were already, I could just tell by the way certain people were reacting on social media whenever Indiana was down 10-0. It's almost like people didn't know what to do with themselves. And I even with myself watching the game here at my house, I did find myself getting up and kind of pacing around a little more than usual, just because it had been the first time this season that we saw Indiana have a deficit of some sort. And I talked about it with Alec Lasley on my show earlier this week. Like, we knew that it was coming. We didn't know for sure whether or not it would happen, but a lot of people had this kind of idea in their brain that this was the game where Indiana was finally going to see some real adversity, and that ended up being the case. And I don't think you could have asked for a better response if you're Kurt Cignetti or anybody involved with this Indiana team.
As soon as Indiana was down that 10-0 score, I was kind of like you. I couldn't sit down, and I was standing up. And it's a good thing I wasn't in the press box environment, but I was standing up and I was kind of locking in a bit. But definitely a great sight to see from Indiana. Go out and put 47 unanswered points on a road conference game is just truly incredible to see.
Yeah, David says, is IU getting close to running up the score? Should IU have subbed the QB out earlier and got TJ some snaps? I think I was fine with the point in the game in which they brought in Taven Jackson. He didn't make any throws. I mean, at the same time, yeah, you would have liked to see him get some more reps, I guess, because as of right now, if you're looking ahead to next season, unless Indiana dives into the portal, Taven Jackson would, of course, be your presumed starter. And when you're in situations like this, it is good to see your backup get those snaps. But I would say, for the most part, when it comes to Taven Jackson specifically, I think we've seen enough out of him to be comfortable, especially when you think about another year of being under the Cignetti, system, if you will, and another year of just building up your body and being ready to be the starter in waiting potentially. I'm not really worried about Taven Jackson sliding into that spot next year. And I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. Just wanted to answer that question that David was presenting. But I think if Cignetti does decide to 100% roll with Taven Jackson and the other guys he's got in the quarterback room, I don't think people should necessarily be worried with what the product on the field may look like when it comes to that point, of course.
What came to my mind in the third quarter was Indiana had that 21-point lead, I think it was. And I was wondering, with that lead and time running out, is the middle of the third quarter a reasonable point to take Curtis Rourke out just because of the injury? He was wearing that glove on his throwing hand the whole game. And John, I'm curious what you were thinking during that sort of time.
Yeah, it's weird. It didn't really cross my mind. I remember also, I mentioned my wife earlier. I was watching it with her. I remember there was a point where I was so comfortable watching the game to where like I don't notice those little intricacies and the importance of, having somebody that has been kind of rehabbing an injury, even though it was a very short-lived time away from snaps on the field. For some reason, that didn't even really cross my mind. It probably should have. But one thing I want to gauge your interest in real quick, Dylan, before we wrap up here in a few minutes. The first college football playoff rankings will be unveiled on Tuesday, which making the AP poll and the coaches poll obsolete moving forward. And we've seen the lack of love that Indiana has received from the AP voters. And I really haven't been keeping up too much with the coaches poll, if I'm being honest. I feel like most people prefer to look at the AP poll as opposed to the coaches poll. But again, neither one of those matter moving forward. Where do you kind of expect the CFP committee to place Indiana? Because one thing I said earlier this week, I feel like, and again, this is just kind of an intuition, so it doesn't necessarily mean anything. It's just where my feeling is right now. I think that the CFP committee is going to have more respect for the Hoosiers than the AP voters have.
I'm really intrigued to see where they put Indiana. Obviously staying at 13 after winning a conference game by 14 points with a backup quarterback, that was impressive. But I think this week blows that away.
Yeah.
I think jumping to maybe that 9 spot is a bit of a stretch. To jump 4 spots, I think you just got to monitor where else the other ranked teams play and finish at. But I think Indiana is really quickly inching towards that. And as I'm on my Twitter after the game, I see Dick Vitale tweeting out about Indiana getting national. I see all these huge analysts and broadcasters and just personalities tweeting about Indiana. And I think that's what's going to maybe help boost Indiana a little bit more, is just seeing the huge winning margin today and all these other weeks and just the dominance from Cignetti, and Cignetti's taken the internet by storm too. So I want to say the popularity in the media could give it a boost as well.
One thing to keep an eye on specifically, if you're looking at some of the other teams who are ranked above Indiana and results that matter for that specifically, and again, the AP poll isn't necessarily going, or the college football playoff rankings aren't necessarily going to be reflective of what the AP poll looked like this past week. And I think that's something that may be tough to wrap around people's minds initially, because it's not, people think that the AP poll may just kind of be like, oh, next week with the CFP rankings, it's just going to be called the CFP rankings. And it's not necessarily the case. You may get totally different opinions on some teams from compared to what you saw with the AP poll. But if we are comparing it right now, teams that were ranked ahead of Indiana, at least one specifically I'm looking at right now, did take a loss today for the first time. That was number 11, Iowa State, lost at home to Texas Tech 23-22. And another one that I would keep an eye on, or a couple later on this evening, you got Texas A&M and South Carolina, Texas A&M going on the road, of course, and the Kentucky traveling to number 7, Tennessee. I don't expect Kentucky to pull off the upset this year, but they did beat a really good Ole Miss team earlier on in the season. So there is that off chance that the Wildcats may make it more competitive than people would imagine against the Volunteers. That's just kind of my initial, what I've been looking at when it comes to, what will the committee value, and when it comes to who they'll be placing the Hoosiers over and behind, and that type of thing.
So then I'd ask you, do you think, aside from the other losses in the ranked games, do you think Indiana's performance today allows them to jump those teams without the losses, or kind of stay in that first spot?
That's interesting. Here, let me pull up I'm going to pull up the top 25 real quick and just kind of reference who I think they should be ahead of. I think going into, at least as of right now, again, we haven't seen what happens with A&M and those games I just mentioned. But I think if the rankings were coming out tomorrow, based off what we've got right here, I think Indiana should jump Clemson. I think Indiana will definitely jump Iowa State. I think they should jump A&M no matter what happens tonight. I even think they should jump Notre Dame, because I know a lot of people think Notre Dame is really good, and they've obviously bounced back very well from their loss to Northern Illinois. But at some point, whenever you're measuring teams up against each other, that loss has to come into play somewhere, right? Because the reason Notre Dame is not getting any flack for now is because that loss happened so early in the season that people don't really think about it anymore, right? And the reason Indiana is so low compared to the others is because of their perception at the beginning of the year, where they were predicted to potentially be one of the worst teams in the Big Ten. So I think a lot of people, voters, I guess, especially, the reason they're not giving Indiana the respect is it's all based on, it goes back to the beginning of the season, to where they just assumed that things weren't going to work out. And that obviously has not been the case. So it takes a long time to get people who have been doubters from the beginning, especially on the national side of things, to really get on board with that type of stuff.
Maybe we should get you on the committee.
Just give me on.
I think that'd make a big change for the next poll.
Yeah, I just have to disguise. I want to tell people I'm affiliated with I'm not affiliated with the university, but my allegiance doesn't lie with Indiana. I'll have to try to convince them that way. But Dylan, if you don't have any more thoughts, we'll go ahead and shut this one down for the night. Anything you want to mention before we close this thing up?
I'm just going to continue to get more and more anticipated for not only the AP poll and the committee vote, but next week's game at home versus Michigan. Hearing some rumbles about maybe a big noon kickoff or some sort of big thing going on campus. So I just think it's going to be a very big game. It's already sold out. Going to be a crazy crowd.
The magical season continues for Indiana Hoosiers football. Indiana basketball is going to tip off, and Indiana football hadn't even taken a loss yet, something that's probably never happened before. So a lot of exciting things going on in Bloomington for both football and basketball that you can keep an eye on, as HoosierIllustrated.com will have you covered on all things going on moving forward. So be sure to check out all that. Follow Dylan Traeger on Twitter. You can follow me if you want. I don't know how interesting I really am, but you can if you want. Also, check out everything going on at HoosierIllustrated.com from Alec, Kyler, Drew, the whole gang. And I'll be back with you guys on Monday for another edition of In Touch with Indiana Sports. We'll hear Mitchell Page's thoughts on everything that happened and talk more big picture stuff about this Indiana football team. So until then, this has been another edition of the HoosierIllustrated.com football post-game wrap-up show.